Okay, so what we're going to do today is to start to put together everything that we've looked at into a kind of new vision of what the structure of sentences is. Not entirely new, obviously, because what we do all of the time is we start with some kind of basic assumption about what we're dealing with. You have to start there. We're assuming all along that the structure of sentences can be graphically illustrated in terms of trees, in terms of phrase structure trees. And we assume that categories like noun and verb and determiner and so forth, that those are basic in language, and that those are going to be used in some way to categorize things and to categorize not only the words but the phrases that are built out of words. So that remains constant. That could be questioned. Everything that we do can be questioned. Anywhere that we go, we're going to run into places where we say, well, you know what, it doesn't really work very well, let's look for something new. We went through the theory of binding from the perspective of government and binding theory, where things were defined in terms of governing category, and we saw that we needed really a hella complex set of rules in order to characterize things in terms of that. And then we looked deeper into it and we found that it was inadequate, that there were problems with that. And where we're going to go is to a version of the theory where that kind of binding theory couldn't even be devised. A version of phrase structure that will require that we have co-argument binding theory. That will be the only choice, basically. If we're going to do it at all in terms of phrase structure trees. And we're assuming phrase structure trees is the way to go, right? So what we've been doing essentially the whole quarter is developing a way into this more elaborate structure that I'm going to start to give you guys today by putting all the pieces in place slowly in different ways and in ways that couldn't even have been outlined originally. Like, you will take this step and that will lead you to somewhere else and so forth, right? Because what we've been doing is redoing the steps that people have been taking with respect to this enterprise over the past 40 years. All of them. And anytime you do anything at this point, if we're going to do something with the theory, we're going to say it's going to look a certain way. All of that, at some level, has to be in mind. Now, you all can't have all of that in mind because it's just too much, right? But you can have pieces of all of that, and the critical pieces are mostly here, I think, if you did all your homework and paid some attention in class. So the generative transformation grammar with interpretive semantics, the so-called standard theory, that was adopted by the mainstream generative grammar, based on a bunch of different converging arguments and stances. A lot of times it's nothing more than stances that are taken about things. The Ray Jackendoff semantics in generative grammar was a PhD dissertation from MIT that got published as a book, and that's where the idea that we're showing here was adopted. And you can see that throughout the course we've been using some kind of version of Jackendoff interpretive semantics. We've been assuming that that's the way things work. And so that is, you'd have a lexical entry, something would be specified about the syntactic structure of a verb. In that version of the theory, you would say, I have an NP complement, and I'm a verb that goes before an NP complement. So this is for the verb break. And I have a meaning, and the meaning would tell me what the arguments are. And then there would be a set of rules for putting, one of the rules would be if you have a thing that is, a thing argument that is the second argument of act, then act is something that comes out in the form do, act on, whatever, right? There's different versions of that are used in the theory. We've been using act. And there would be a rule that the second argument there, that's going to be the one that will be the NP complement. And the actor argument, the first argument, so in those argument arrays, you have an abstract predicate act. It has two arguments. You interpret the first one as being the actor, the second one as being the acted upon thing, the agent and patient, and so forth. And then by general rule, the patient will be the complement. That's sort of, we've been assuming this sort of stuff all along, that there could be some kind of principle like that. So that's the basic idea. And then, so you have a fairly simple deep syntactic structure, or underlying structure, or base structure. It was called at this point I don't even remember. They started calling it D structure because they didn't want to say deep structure, because they had all the psychologists thinking that transformational grammar would give you insights into the depths of people's minds, and it was deep stuff, right? And you know, it may even be true, but they didn't want to do that, so they started calling it D structure. But originally deep structure, and then surface structure started to become called S structure. But the idea, you could see here, there was not much going on. There would have been, as I said before, this tense element that would have been an ox element. So that idea goes all the way back to very early days in generative grammar. And then you have the S structure. And then from that, you would get the overall meaning. So you put things into the tree, and the meaning would be determined by a conglomeration of the information encoded in the S structure. So the S structure is really, the sentence structure is showing you schematic stuff, as I said always, right? That there's going to be places in there. In syntactic structure, you have to put the words in orders. The orders are going to indicate phrases, and the position of those phrases is going to give you hints about the semantic structure. And then the semantic structure, so then so what you're talking about, what you're communicating, what you're saying is the meaning is given in this theory by some kind of logical structure thing that would have, you know, stuff. So we've got a the in there. That wouldn't be from the verb break. That's from the sentence structure. And that the would have as a manifestation some kind of effect on the meaning. And that's being represented here with, because we don't know, you can't really give it all just def, right? So definite is, there's something more underneath that, of course, but with the representation, we're going to keep it fairly simple. Okay, so we've been working with a theory of that sort, but we've been elaborating it and showing some of the transformations and stuff, and then also starting to put semantic pieces into the tree, right? Things like, I mean, think about it, things like pro, these empty subjects, they're there because they're really representing something that's not there phonologically, and not obviously there in the structure, but is there semantically in some sense, right? And so that's been kind of the game. Now, when Jackendorf, and in conjunction with other theorists at the time, proposed having an interpretive semantics with syntactic structure, at some level the vision was there's an autonomous syntax. That was one of Chomsky's strong beliefs, and what made him interesting to the world in some sense, that there's syntactic structure that we know about, and all of that stuff operates in a way that is independent of meaning. The syntax is autonomous and so forth. And then so the stance that they took was to separate out and keep separate the semantics. There was some syntactic argumentation for that, but it wasn't very strong. What was really being sought out was avoiding stuff like this, where the tree is a representation of every piece of meaning that you can find, and that's all there is. So generative semantics would have had some James Macaulay and George Lakoff. They weren't they weren't students at MIT, but there were some students at MIT that they were attracting. They were crafting this vision of syntax that had a lot of appeal among the students at MIT, but there was like a battle between these two camps. So the idea here, notice that this is the sentence structure for Floyd broke the vase, right? But this is the deep structure, right? The deep syntactic structure, or the underlying structure, and it's full of all kinds of stuff, right? So let's just go through what's there. But first of all, George Lakoff would give up on this, as would I guess they had to or whatever. Not all of them did, actually. Jim Macaulay just kept doing it in some fashion, and wrote articles about how it was never really a good idea to move away from this. But George Lakoff took things in a completely different direction. He had originally introduced into the theory of into generative grammar a lot of the stuff that got adopted later. Like, he was one of the proponents of using logic, things from mathematical philosophical logic, in generative grammar, because he was a logician and a mathematician. That was his training. But then he just, after a while, said, no, you know what, none of this works. You're making assumptions. Basically what he did was to say, you're working with assumptions to begin with that are wrong. So your basic underlying assumptions don't work. And he had developed that in Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things, a big book where he argues at length that Aristotelian categories that Western science is based on are wrong. I mean, he just takes a really strong stance of that sort. And so there aren't discrete categories like noun and verb. There's things that are all in between those. He argued based on stuff from psychology about prototype theory in psychology, that the way categories works are that there are prototypes, and things that match those prototypes to some extent fall within that category. And therefore you can get categories with a radial structure, things that are more or less close to the prototype, and then things on the edges that can be unclear whether they're in the category or not. So there's a whole line of argumentation of that sort. It's called Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things because in the Australian language that he wrote one of the chapters on, the interesting discovery that wasn't made by him, it was made by someone working on durable as in the field, right? Doing field work with durable, DYIRBAL. Found this system where it was kind of like Romance language. You have masculine and feminine gender, but there were, I can't remember if it was 3 or 4 categories, so there are like 4 categories. And one of them was kind of like masculine, and the other one was kind of like feminine. But unlike in Romance languages where everything has to be put in those categories and you cannot see any basis for it, the claim was that they had this, I think it was women, it was a female, male, edible food, or something like that, or not, I don't know, something like that, some kind of food category that didn't include all foods, and then everything else. So that was the way that the noun class categories were, and there was morphology that you would use for these different things, and the whole system depended on this. The verb would agree with things based on which one of those classes you're in and so forth. So it's a very interesting language, and basically there's just the story that you have to tell is that, women is the basis of the category, but fire is there too, and dangerous things because women are dangerous things, and some sort of story like that, and then there are things like this certain kind of bug that is in that category because it stings you, and it's kind of like, I don't know, it's some kind of crazy story like that, but it kind of all fits together and makes some sense, right? So because the moon is feminine, it's going to be in this category as well, right? Oh no, I think it went something like this: the sun is in this category, right? And the sun can burn you. And they say that when this bug bites you, it's like a burning sensation, right? And so therefore you're in that category with burning. Anyway, so that was the kind of thing that kind of, the basic then concept is that kind of category structure is everywhere, and it's in language. And this idea that things are either in a category or not, that this whole theory is based on, is wrong. So then he took off on that and also worked on metaphors and how metaphors pervade language. And there's lots of people doing work on this stuff now where they're looking at the language of politics about issues in the world, and they look and they see that, well, they're using these same expressions over and over again that aren't literally true, but they seem to be using those expressions in such a way as to build a belief system. And so belief systems are built by language using metaphors is the basic idea. And then he goes on to, so he has like a big career and ends up being one of the most cited authors ever in any field, like in a list with, Freud and whatnot, right? He takes that metaphor theory and the category structure theory to philosophy and says that, all this stuff that people are doing in philosophy is just, they're making up metaphors for stuff, right? And guess what? Math too, right? So you can imagine he pissed off a lot of mathematicians. The basic idea was, this math stuff, it works and that's fine, but the belief that it's something about laws in the universe is crazy. It's just stuff that people made up using their ordinary conceptual devices, applying metaphors to the realm of physics. So he does some radical stuff. Anyway, we started out doing this, and was one of the main proponents of this sort of structure for trees. So let's see how it goes. It's just doing really nothing more than we've done, but just adding it all up in a different way. So there's a process of verb raising. Remember we say that the verb moves up from the V node to the tense, and can, in some languages, right? In English, it doesn't always do. But that idea was all over the place. And if you look across languages, you find all kinds of cases where two verbs combine next to each other, and they have to be next to each other. They're probably separate words, but they're kind of not. And then when they do that, it's like, oh, all of a sudden you have a single clause. So they're in Spanish, if you have, I want to go to the store, it's not to go, it's I want go to the store. And it can be just I want go. And any arguments of the verb go will be treated as if they're just arguments of want. That's a very pervasive phenomenon in language. So the way to deal with that kind of phenomenon in this theory is to have verb raising all over the place, right? Smushing together verbs from embedded clauses into main clauses. That kind of thing happens a lot. So we've been using that, but the idea goes way back, right? So you're really starting out here. Notice that what you're starting out with is the semantic representation in tree structure. Become broken. Something, right? There's an argument of become broken. But it was, in this case, it was put in with come about, because come about's just as good as become, right? And it's more colloquial, sort of, right? And they wanted to have it's all over the place, right? Because then there's going to be, because back then raising of subject, so like the subject raising things with seems, it seems that that guy is nice, that there's an it there. Well, they just took the assumption that there was an it there to begin with. And there was lots of deletion rules. So start out with an it in places where you don't really have anything semantically. And then you just go about replacing it's all you want up to a certain point. You might not. You might stop, right? So they wanted to have it replacement everywhere. And so it's easier to say it came about that it was broken than it became that it was broken, right? You couldn't really say that. So that's sort of what the idea was there. But you have become broken is in there somewhere, and it has arguments, and then the it gets replaced, and one way to replace it is to move the s into its position. And then you can do more it replacement, and this is actually raising to object. So things can raise to object. All the things that we've been doing were there. I'm going to show you in a minute how you could motivate some of this stuff, right? This wasn't just arbitrary. This was done based on standard syntactic argumentation, doing the same kinds of things we've been doing. Let's try this. Does that explain something about language? Does it predict something? Are your predictions true? It's doing science, right? Which is what we've been doing, right? Going through the exercise at some great length. Here's how you would do science with this game, in this game of sentence structure. So this verb then would raise, again, because you could just raise verbs out of clauses. And then you would have cause become broken. X causes something to become broken. Because the meaning is break, right? And the meaning is going to be do something, cause something else to become broken, right? That's what the meaning is, right? So but we're just, that representation, instead of putting it into a logical formula, why would you put it into a logical formula anyway? Why did they ever do that? Well, because they wanted to use logic and make it look like science, right? Basically, right? But it's all just language. So why not make it be just language? And we know we need tree structures anyway, so have the representation. That was the kind of logic, right? So, and then verb raising again would give us X acts, and because of that causes himself to cause it. That acting makes it so if I act, I cause something to become broken. As a result of acting, I cause something to become broken. Notice that the two variables, the x's match there. And then we do some more it replacement, because that's what we're going to do all over the place. And we do, then we would have done a transformation called equivalent NP deletion. What would that do? Get rid of the second Floyd, right? That's pro, right? This would be a control structure. There would be control going on here. So all of the things we've been doing were here at some level in some way, almost all of them, right? Didn't have it replacement. We don't have that anymore. We do it a different way. But it's kind of the same thing. Verb raising all over the place, it replacement all over the place. We just do a bunch of this stuff, and we end up with the verb at the highest level where tense has been. And then we know that part of our knowledge is that, oh, the way you realize the verb meaning, or the meaning happen X in cause, become bogus, and so forth, right, is with when you add past tense to it, the phonological form is broke. So there would be a phonological rule that would spell out that big, huge, long verb as broke, right? That was the idea. And then, so lexical insertion would occur at some point during that. So what's happening is you've got the meaning all displayed there, and it's in a syntactic tree. And then you do just nothing but operations you need to have anyway. It replacement we know happens. Verb raising happens. All of that stuff. And then at a certain point, you throw in the words. And here we're just looking at throwing in the verb, of course. Because we put in the values of the NPs right from the start. And then we do some more it replacement. And we end up with, but we have then also illocutionary, there's a representation of illocutionary acts. So what kind of thing is this? Is this a performative sentence? So we know that there's all this stuff in the literature on pragmatics about sentences that are questions or declarative sentences and so forth, right? So interrogative, declarative, all of that kind of stuff is part of the meaning of a sentence. You're going to have that in there somehow. So in this theory, what would you do? You would put it in as part of the syntactic representation, as part of the meaning of this, right? I'm a declarative sentence. And a declarative sentence is one in which you would have, I say to you, would be the preface of every sentence in every declarative sentence. So all of that would be there. You would delete the, you've done all this raising, did the lexical insertion to get rid of all the causes and becomes and acts and all of that kind of stuff, right? All smushed together into a verb. And you end up with, like, the vase on the surface, just what you see is what you've got. So that's the theory, right? Complicated, right? But kind of what we've been doing, right? Right? Sort of. Not all that different, really. The underlying assumptions were there are transformations that turn deep structures into surface structures. The whole theory is built around that assumption. And for good reasons. There's lots of argumentation given for that. So there are it replacement and was raising, right? Raising to subject or raising to object, actually, in both cases. Could have both of those, right? So here would be the logic. I like it that you do that. I like that you do that. There's an it there. What the hell is that it doing there? It's there because it's there all over the place, right? And you mostly delete them. You replace them with something else, And it would have probably been the case that I like you doing that would have involved that it being replaced not by the clause, but by you. You would have moved up into that slot, right? So raising to object, as well as raising to subject, all of those kinds of things are replacement. It seems that Floyd broke the vase. Floyd seems to have broken the vase. Floyd broke the vase. The vase was broken by Floyd. That's the passive transformation. We haven't looked at that in this class, and we won't, because it's not really all that interesting, although it was this that Chomsky used originally as a basis of, one of the bases of having there be a transformational grammar. Because he observed that the facts are that Floyd broke the vase and the vase was broken by Floyd being the same thing. And all of the constraints you have to put in the grammar for Floyd broke the vase work exactly the same way and the vase was broken by Floyd. So the most parsimonious grammar, the simplest one, the one that captures all of the generalizations, is one in which those are the same sentence. They're just transforms, right? You just need a simple rule to move one into the other. And transformations, another observation was that that transformations don't change the meaning of sentences in general. That was a kind of generalization. That was the kind of the underlying assumption everywhere, was that, if you take, for example, it seems that Floyd broke the vase, Floyd seems to have broken the vase, mean the same thing. We would have an ugly grammar if we didn't relate those two sentences, was the basic idea. Therefore, we've got transformations, and we've got them all over the place. Now, if you take that assumption that the meaning of the sentences comes from the deep structure, so you say, well, it's the deep structure that you use to give you the meaning of sentences, then, and that was a hypothesis, the Katz postal hypothesis, a famous thing playing itself out there in those days, was being followed. So here was the game. We've got this interesting set of facts. We know we now can do a pretty good grammar of English if we have phrase structure, and we have transformations, and we can capture lots of generalizations about how things work. And we've looked at a lot of data. So now here's a hypothesis, Katz postal hypothesis. Would make some sense. Let's pursue it. And pursuing it ended up with generative. It was an inevitable consequence of pursuing the set of assumptions that we have here only, that you would end up with generative semantic. Because you can represent the decomposition of meanings of verbs mostly with cause, become, act, do, and things that are verbs anyway, and that can go into structures that would allow you. You notice you can't pronounce that deep structure, right? But that was okay. It was an abstract deep structure. You never pronounce deep structure. But the pieces all there are things that could be parts of phrase structure and language. So deep structure is the complete representation of meaning. If you do that, then it's going to have illocutionary force, not only illocutionary force, but presuppositions. You can see how this would get really hairy very quickly, right? So that was the idea. And then it was motivated by the same kinds of evidence that was being used to argue for everything else. Scientific evidence. It wasn't just, let's have fun, right? I mean, they were having fun, obviously, but so they knew there was an assumption. There's a rule of reflexization, and it's constrained by, at that time, it was called command. And not C command, but command. And command says, command and precedence. Those were the main things, right? And command was, you command each other if you're in the same clause. If you're clause mates, you're in command domains and so forth. Wilbur knows that Floyd likes Floyd would have been turned in. So underlyingly, right, you would just put the full noun phrases for everything that you wanted to represent, and you would have some mechanism for saying that they have the same value. So Floyd likes Floyd, where Wilbur knows that Floyd likes Floyd, where Floyd has the same value in both of those cases. That would require a transformation to take place, because you just can't really say that, right? That meaning cannot be said that way. So that's the transformation of reflexivization. You reflexivize that, and you get himself if the value of Floyd is the same, those two Floyds. Otherwise, you would get him. Okay, so that was the rule, and we've gone through, how you would do that nowadays. And then there was observed things like this, right? That there must be transformations that delete the antecedents that make reflexivization possible. And we have a way, we've been looking at ways how you do this nowadays, right? But the thinking was this, right? You have Floyd wants Floyd to be able, Floyd to take care of Floyd. Because remember, you're putting everything in there, right? And it would actually have been, I say to you, it happens that Floyd wants, and all of that, right? It to be the case that Floyd, and all of that. But, so I'm abstracting away from those things because they're just kind of pointless, right? To put in here. Floyd wants Floyd to be able Floyd to take care of himself. So we reflexivize the last thing in the chain, where we have a bunch of all same reference NPs. The rules are, can't leave them that way, sorry, can't have too much, because the force would be, we don't want too much redundancy. We want enough information, we want enough, in terms of information theory, you want a sufficient amount of redundancy, but you also want to keep that reduced enough so that the message is small enough, right? And so you would then delete by equivalent NP deletion was the rule, all of the ones that you don't need, right? If they're subject of an infinitive and your reference is determined by the next highest clause up, then you would have another transformation to do that. Okay, and then already these guys were saying, well, look, we have an argument from reflexivization for having illocutionary force in the clause, because we can say things like this. Floyd claims that people like himself are better off without money. We can do that, right? And it must be the case then that himself, since it doesn't have an antecedent in the same clause, but it's in this situation where it's actually not a co-argument with anything, right? They didn't really quite formulate the constraint that way in those days, but it had to look to the next highest clause up. So that was already clear to these guys. Really, I say guys because they're really, I guess George Lakoff's wife was kind of doing this stuff, Robin Lakoff. But George Lakoff, by the way, is a professor at UC Berkeley, has been there for a long time. And his wife was doing this kind of stuff back then, so I shouldn't just say, unless I'm talking to them personally, I could say, you dudes, but anyway, it was mostly guys. They knew this, right? And then they observe that, hey, look at this. We can say, I declare to you that people like myself are better off without money. But I can't say, I declare to you that people like himself are better off without money under any set of circumstances, right? So why is it just myself and yourself that are possible here? When they don't even have an antecedent in the same clause, they're not working by the regular rules. Well, the answer is that we've got I and you in the main clause, right? So then we can get people like myself are better off without money out of the clear blue sky. How do we come up with that out of the clear blue sky? Because it's a declarative sentence, and declarative sentences always have underlyingly, I declare to you that, right? But it would be extremely redundant to be adding that all over the place because that's the default, right? But from the perspective of syntactic theory and that set of rules, you reflexivize only under conditions X and you're sensitive to the syntactic structure. Then you're just, in order to use that rule, the parsimonious thing to do is, since you're going to allow yourself meaning to be in the syntactic tree, you allow yourself to do that, right? So this is all nothing but applying science to the game, right? Given a set of assumptions, given that this is a rule of the language. How does it all work out, right? Okay, so you follow me here, right? You get the idea. You don't have to know the exact details here, right? So we have motivated abstract structure, right? It's not arbitrary. There's abstract structure that is motivated by the facts of the language. It allows us to not have to add any special rules about reflexivization. Rules that are already there handle this. And all we're doing is giving you the meaning. Okay, so what we're going to do now is, and what we've been doing sort of all along, is move back towards generative semantics. And what is generative? Because that's what has happened in this theory that we're working on. More and more, the pieces of generative semantics are put back into the representations, using the same kind of logic that they used when they constructed generative semantics for the most part. So the accusative v-ing, the accusative v-ing DP shell that we've been looking at, right? So we're saying, well, what's this thing that we have? It's kind of clause-like, but isn't exactly clause-like. And it seems to actually be like a noun phrase. It goes in a DP slot. Well, we'll have it be a DP, but we'll make it be clause-like at the same time, right? That was sort of the kind of using that, looking at what the evidence shows us. What does it suggest? And we're willing to be daring, right? We'll do things that maybe aren't obvious and that the traditional grammarians wouldn't have done and that you would never hear about in your high school English class, right? Or in the class where they teach English teachers to be English teachers. You wouldn't want to be teaching too much of this, right? Actually, probably be a good idea. You'd actually come out understanding these things better, but it's kind of hard, right? But we have motivated abstract structure. We say that there's that's not an arbitrary choice to put the B there. Having it there, it's silent. We have a reason why it's silent, because B can only be overt if it's in a V slot. But it's still an abstract move that you can't look at this and see it, right? You can only get there by looking at indirect evidence. But the main thing is we're looking here, we've got DP here. We don't want to have just empty arbitrary D's in there to be the heads of those just because we're trying to get our structure to work. At some level we're doing that, right? But we want to have it be different. So but if we look at this more carefully, we see that this having that B in there automatically accounts for the verb being in the present participle form. Because B as an auxiliary requires that. If I have a VP and I'm B, and I have a VP as my complement, then I require a present participle form. So we automatically account for that, right? That's a good result. But we can do more even, right? If we say that this D is the form of a progressive auxiliary B, right? It's the D form of the progressive auxiliary. It's that same thing that you get in I am doing my homework, right? That's just that it's silent, right? If we say that, it also automatically accounts for the impossibility of things like the idea of him being nice. Even though, notice we can say the idea of him having been nice is fine, right? So we can put other auxiliary, we can put the have auxiliary into this structure without any problem, right? But you cannot put the be in there, right? So why is that? Well, you could say, well, you don't want to have too many beings next to each other, right? To make copies of the same verb, but in general, it's not a problem to have copies of the same verb next to each other, right? He was being imprisoned. We can have a progressive auxiliary be next to passive or present participle auxiliary be. So it's not, but here we get an automatic account of that, right? Because the be is already there. It's already in the structure. So you account for that in a kind of cool way, right? Okay, and then finally, after a kind of long prelude, we can go back to the what we left off last time as a problem, that We didn't have a solution for it. There wasn't a neat solution for it. But we're going to have a neat solution for this. And the fact that we have a neat solution for this is going to provide evidence for all of the different pieces of the story that we've been developing. So we know we can say Elaine kept her laptop with her. I dropped my keys behind me, not myself, right? So it looks like we've got clausemates. But we're not getting the reflexive form like we would expect. The thing, when we have a pronominal element in that slot, it's not being reflexivized because of Elaine with the subject as you would expect on the, that would be the default assumption. So it's a classic problem in generative grammar that I don't know why I dropped. Oh, okay, but we noticed that at the same time, so we want to have a story that what the story we want to have is that laptop with her, right? Here's what we want to get, right? Is in a different co-argument domain, right? And so one way of doing that would be to say that her laptop with her is a small clause, right? Notice we would solve the problem if we could do that, right? But it doesn't behave like a small clause in the sense that we want to keep everything. It doesn't behave like a constituent. So if I had Elaine kept, think about it, if I had Elaine kept, and then I have small clause, her laptop with her, then her laptop with her would have two arguments, her laptop and her. And that would define a co-argument domain. And her then would not be in the same co-argument domain with Elaine. That's the result we want to get. But we've got a sort of problem here, right? Because here it doesn't look like small clauses in general, the ones we've been looking at, behave like constituents. If it's an entity, a little clause by itself, it should behave like a constituent, right? Like a phrase. And it doesn't, right? So that's a problem. Right? Because you can say what Elaine couldn't imagine was a ghost behind her. That's fine, right? Because so we want to, Elaine couldn't imagine a ghost behind her. We get the right result. Because we've already said, well, a ghost behind her in that structure is a small clause. So you see what the dilemma is, right? We want it to be the case that where it would work out perfectly if it were the case that her laptop with her were a small clause, defining its own binding co-argument domain for with respect to reflexive. And then we would get, just like in what Elaine couldn't imagine a ghost behind herself is weird, right? Same thing, right? So we've got the same problem with respect to the reflexive anaphora, but we've got a different ball game at some level. So because here we have something like this, right, where a ghost behind her is a small clause that we worked on what the internal structure of that would be. So and it would have the same meaning as Elaine couldn't imagine a ghost being behind her, right? That would be the meaning of this, right? And so we have it be the case that that's what the syntactic structure is, except not without being, just plain B, right? So we have this structure, and we get the right results. We've got the right meaning. We've got everything that we need here. We get the right reflexive facts because reflexive pronouns here, right? So we have copular B in its silent D form. Notice that we don't have progressive auxiliary B. We have copular B. And then if we have this sort of structure, then the arguments of behind are the DP with her or herself and a ghost. And that defines a co-argument domain. You can look back in the notes, co-argument, binding theory, or look in the book, it does the same thing. Those would be both semantic and syntactic co-arguments, right, by our definitions. And then these things would, at the same time, by our definitions, be semantic and or I should say, syntactic coarguments, right? Not semantic, I got that wrong. It's just syntactic coargument. But that's still a coargument domain with respect to binding theory, with respect to reflexive and so forth. So we get then the right results that we have to have her if it's going with a lane. And we cannot have herself, because herself needs to be bound in its coargument domain if it has a coargument. And it does, because it has a ghost. Right? Okay, so we got the whole story for that worked out. For the imagined DP small clause structure. And we want to get that to work for this other problematic case, because we need to have some kind of story. And the story has to be good, otherwise it's pointless. What we're doing is pointless, right? It's not science. Of course, it probably isn't anyway, but you know, we're playing the game as if it is. You know, I know it's okay if I'm agnostic, right? At the same time as being a believer, can you be both? I believe in this, but you know, I'm agnostic at the same time, right? Kind of like well, never mind. So here we're going to introduce another idea that became extremely important in the theory, was the idea that, well, look at this. If we look at most of the structures that we actually motivate in language, they almost always seem to only have binary branching. So you don't get more than two branches. So what would we do if that's the case? So let's suppose that that's true, that all free structure trees have to have binary branching, no more than two nodes. So again, this is a hypothesis, right? Will it give us anything? Is it worthwhile? Is it worth pursuing? I actually have argued in published work that there was never really any good reason for it. So I'm agnostic. But I can see how it could work. Right? And so I'm exploring here, building up everything that we've been doing, how it could be used in a useful way. But this idea really was sort of motivated by a kind of assumption that from Richard Kane, and Richard Kane was well, who was it? Tell me who it was. I've already said this. I've probably already talked about it. A student of Chomsky's at MIT. When? In the late 60s and early 70s, more like early 70s. Wrote the first generative grammar of French. Big influence. Worked on, continues to work on things. But every once in a while he would come up with ideas that people would say, well, that's crazy, you can't do that. And then he would argue in the way that we're doing for that crazy idea. And some of them were latched onto, and this was one of them. But he was really arguing for this from the perspective of beauty. Wouldn't it be more beautiful if all of our trees were uniform at some levels? That's why I'm if we take the cases where, well, it looks like we have two complements, right? It's clear that with give, you have gave her brother a present. And those things have to all be there. And give is a verb that has three arguments, right? A giver, thing given, recipient, agent, theme, recipient, right? We went through all how the thematic roles work. They got to be complements, and we're assuming complements go in at the same level. And we have actually argued for that complements are sisters of the head that they are complements of, or non-subject arguments. We look at the evidence for constituency, and we don't get it that that her brother and a present form a constituent. And it would be it's kind of silly, right, to think, well, her brother, a present, is a clause of some kind, right? We don't think of it that way. That's not our normal intuition about these things, right? We think of it as this clause being revolving around give. and give having two things they go after, right? And there's these three arguments and so forth. The syntactic evidence, there's no evidence that her brother in a present form a constituent by the normal set of of evidence, the kinds of evidence that we've used to establish constituency would never give this as a result. So people were going, in fact, this was Keynes, one of Keynes. This came from Richard Kane. And I actually heard him give the talk where he hadn't even published this yet, saying this, and everybody in the audience was just scratching their heads and going, because he's going to claim, well, this is actually a constituent, her brother a present, and it's a clause, right? So that's the direction that we're headed. And everybody was scratching their heads, and then he went and gave some crazy scientific evidence argument of the standard kind for doing just this. I won't give you that argument because I think it ultimately wasn't very good, but but what if we find, so the question is, what if we do find some good reason? And now I'm going to kind of go through some stuff where a path down which you can look back and say, oh yeah, there's good evidence. So the idea, which here this is an instantiation of Keynes' idea. Originally what Keynes had said was, because this was really fairly early on when Keynes did this, he said it's a small clause, and small clauses are labeled SC, because he said, I don't know what the internal structure of those is, but I'm going to say that her brother of present is a small clause. And then what Richard Larson did, and again, student of John's, no, I actually don't know. I'm not really sure about that. I think he might have come from a different school, actually. But he comes along and publishes a famous article in which he argues for what would come to be known as VP shells. And VP shells would have this sort of structure. And so what he's after at some level is, can we make sense out of these kinds of things where we have more than one complement for a verb and we still have binary branching? And he gave actually a really fairly good set of arguments for doing this that I won't go through. I'm going to go through a different, only one of the routes of arguing. But basically here was the idea that you have verb raising, right? So notice that we're going back to generative semantics in a big way here. We're going to be doing that. You can have verbs be in different places in the verb phrase, and they just go and move up to where you need them to be. So that would be by virtue of raising. So the verb starts out in a little VP, and then I'll work this out a little bit differently later, but the original idea, or one of the original ways of doing this, was to say that, oh, now we have two kinds of VP. And you'll see that we'll call them different things. We'll actually call them different things. But the basic idea was this, that you have a verb phrase, small clause, right? It's a logical possibility. Nothing would preclude this, where you have that verb phrase, small clause, that is the argument of give, has both of the arguments in it. Okay, you're with me here, right? Now, then the trick is, well, but we know that these are all arguments of give, right? Well, that's because give is the head of both the larger VP and the smaller VP, because we're allowing ourselves to have verb movement, verb raising. Okay, so you see that all of the pieces here, we're allowing ourselves a little bit of liberty, right? But it's a liberty that is arguably motivated. If you look across languages, we know that there is verb raising that happens. You know, or there are phenomena in languages all over the place that suggest that historically this kind of thing happens all over the place. And in some languages you can see it. There's the historical development is still encoded in the forms of things. So, I mean, one of the things that had happened a lot in languages is that verbs would combine with little verb phrases with give, and give me any verb on top of that. And then what would happen is that the give would glom onto that verb and become an affix. And then you would have it be the case that you could turn I baked a cake. So the language would do things like this. I baked a cake to give to Martin. The give part moves up onto the verb. I baked give. And then you would get, I baked give Martin a cake. Right? That's the historical origin of a lot of those kinds of constructions in languages is from a verb give in an embedded clause that we know glommed on to the main verb. So the basic idea that there could be verb raising is not crazy, and especially with with things like this. So, but we're going to exploit it in ways that aren't motivated historically. Okay, so we could then go further and imagine that we have what we've been doing. Say, well, there's a lexical entry. It's got a lexical conceptual structure. It's got syntactic information about all this information, right? We have a theory where the semantic module, there's a lexical semantic module that's separated out, associated with lexical entry, and then there's the phrase structure tree. And you go back and you look at, so it's both Richard Larson and Ken Hale and Samuel Kaiser from MIT. Ken Hale being the longtime anthropological linguist at MIT. He was the one that was doing field work on language with the students and teaching them how to do field work all throughout the 70s and 80s. But he actually would come up with some good ideas. And I saw the talk also where he presented this idea before it was published, and where we asked him, we said, Ken, what's going on here? This looks like generative semantics. And he said, yep, I always believed in generative semantics. That's what it is. So the idea is you could put those things back in the tree, act, cause, have. This would be the tree for give. And then if you do that, you can reduce the lexical entry, right? This is the lexical entry. Or you could you take what you're doing basically is saying, well, instead of writing it out like that, like as I already suggested, right? Write it out in the tree. It's a representation of the same thing. So that could be the lexical entry for give. And you could even go further and say, well, you don't really need lexical entries then. You could just have all trees that way. So the way that the complements or the arguments of have would be represented in a tree like this is like this. The arguments are, like we've been saying, either sister complement position or specifier position, and that's just the norm. Those two positions in trees are what you use to put in arguments. So we've got that idea already out there. Let's just go all the way. So we've got a verb. All of that stuff is encoded. All of the stuff we've got in a lexical entry, except for the tense, right, is encoded in the phrase structure tree like this. We've got it all there. And then what if we just go, smoosh it all together, right? Once we've added the past tense, we get a whole clause. Adding the past tense, the I node, gives us, once we add that functional structure, we've got the whole clause, right? And let's instead of act, we'll call it do, because we never knew which one to use, right? Do means act, right? People have gone different ways with that. I don't know. We'll use do. Because that became more popular. And then what we do following Hale and Kaiser is to separate out the two kinds of verb phrases. So the higher one, the one where you introduce things like agent, is little v. And the other one is big V, where you use V. So we can sort of, all that is just showing that there are reasons for doing it. but you can separate those things out. Okay, so far we're, and then what you do is, well, put the cause and have together there, and put cause and have together with do, and leave the traces behind, right? So it's all of it is there together, and you get an amalgamation, and it's all give, right? And so give is, you could leave in the tree if you want, right? Representations of those meaning pieces that are part of the tree. And so we've gone, pretty far here, right? It makes sense you could have verb raising, but let's go even further and say, well, you have verb raising because verbs are amalgam of these meaning components. Cause have would be all over the place. Cause become. Cause be. Cause be at. That kind of, all of those kinds of things are all over the place in the meanings of the word. So let's just put them in a tree. Put the meanings in there, and then those empty slots in the tree then don't seem so weird, right? That's basically what we're saying, right? They're not weird. It's just a representation of meaning. So you see, we're moving along that road of saying, yeah, let's have the tree at all levels. Now, we're not even saying that there's a deep structure anymore. We're saying the tree at all levels has it all there. We know that that's all there. And that stuff is all going to play a role in the syntax of the language, even though we can only see that and know that by really, really subtle indirect evidence, right? That we can come at this sort of thing. And so what does that do then? That leaves I guess it sort of leaves Chomsky in the place he wants to be, right? How is it that people can know this when the linguist, it took them 40 years to discover that the trees must be like this and they're so freaking abstract, right? Because it's universal grammar. And to the extent that that you can find evidence for this kind of stuff in particular languages, and it can be extended in useful ways, or linguistic data from lots of different languages can be accommodated, then you have a good story. So that's kind of the ultimate goal at some level. And so, you could be agnostic and whatnot, but you still, it's scientific inquiry, and there are interesting hypotheses, there are interesting ideas here. Okay, so then when we have a structure like this, here's what happens, right? Her brother have a present. You think about it, right? If I say I gave her brother a present, then it ends up being the case that her brother has a present. And we're just showing that in the tree. Her brother has a present is a result of the action. But then we've got now raising, this is actually raising to object. The DP, that is the subject of have a present, raises into the slot where it becomes the syntactic argument of give. It's now a syntactic argument of give. And these things are actually all semantic and syntactic co-arguments by virtue of the fact that give occupies both of the verb slots. Both of the V slots is occupied by give. Because give is all of that. Do, cause, have. All one argument structure. And the meaning is Elaine's doing something, caused her brother to have a present. Give is the concept that gives you. Or do it like this, right? Whatever. All of these things. Elaine's doing something, caused her brother to have a present. Elaine, act, cause, all of that stuff. Or this tree. Are all representations of that same thing. The meaning of the sentence. There's lots of ways, right? Single predicate representing an amalgam. So we have here the VP shell hypothesis, right? That's what we're working with, and we're going to go down some distance on that road. Now, we get the right results here, right? If we say Elaine gave Newman, well, so imagine a scenario, right? We've got Newman, we've got Elaine, and Elaine decided that she would give in to Newman's request for marriage. Then you could say, well, Elaine gave Newman herself in marriage. Would be a possible thing, right? I mean, it's weird, right? You wouldn't do it that way because you have better ways of doing it, but you wouldn't say her. You wouldn't say her under any circumstance. So the question is, which one is better, herself or her? Huh? Neither one is good? Okay. Gave Newman herself in marriage. Seems at least better, a little bit better, right? We won't push this too far. But we would expect not to have her under any circumstance because these are semantic and syntactical arguments. So actually, you could argue that, well, I don't know what you could. Actually, this is one of the arguments that Larson used, that it's better this way than the other way, right? But I guess what you'd want to do is to, actually what you would prefer would be wouldn't you prefer Elaine gave herself to Newman in marriage? You would prefer that one, right? Because, well, whatever. So the availability of that is going to have an influence on what you trust to be okay here, right? But you wouldn't say Elaine gave her to Newman in marriage. That would be absolutely impossible, right? Okay, so even if that's not perfect there, Elaine gave her brother a present. What Elaine gave, so we have a structure like this, right? What Elaine gave her brother was a present, that's fine. What Elaine gave was her brother a present? No. It was her brother a present that Elaine gave? No. We've got to have an account of that because we're showing her brother a present to be a syntactic constituent, a single constituent. So we're going to say, well, that's because it's a VP small clause. And we don't know why. But VP small clauses, we know that there are certain things that can undergo these transformations, that can be in those structures. And what if we just say, well, VP small clause isn't one of them? Then, so it's kind of a weird route, but we have a special thing here now. We've just designated a special kind of thing we haven't seen before, right? A VP small clause. And let's say that that's the explanation. So pseudo-cleft and cleft constructions can focus on VP, PP, CP of main verbs. Actually, not IP either, I don't think. In some cases, they can. In some cases, not always. But not that, right? Okay, so that's one piece of the story. And I'll just take it a little bit further here. And the argument here is going to be that we need this anyway, this kind of structure for other things. And since we need it for other things, all we're doing is applying the same structure here for give. And we need it for things like this. The storm caused problem. What is the structure of that, right? And the structure of that is, well, we also need this, right? Have a present. That kind of, so we need the structure like X caused Y, and we need the structure X has Y. All of those things are needed anyway, and we're going to say that this have thing shows up all over the place. And one of the places it's going to show up is in this. I want a drink, because that's going to mean nothing different than I want to have a drink. And we're going to be able to show, we won't do it today, but we're going to be able to show that sentences like I want a drink have the same syntactic properties of sentences like I want to have. Nothing different in terms of the meaning, and sharing the same set of syntactic properties. So therefore, we need to have structures like that anyway. They can be incorporated into our story for give at no cost. Okay, so what we'll do, well, I'll stop here for now, but the strategy now will be to argue that Kramer's departure caused a lot of heartache must have a structure like this.